Hello and welcome back to Documentary Film. Hopefully everyone had a good break and we're ready to come back to Module 8 and to look at Kanesatake, 270 Years of Resistance. This film is in conjunction with our theme for this week on Marginalized Voices. The other films we're going to look at is The Other Side of the Ledger. I would recommend watching maybe the first 10 minutes of it. There's a link on FOL. The first 10 minutes, I think, gives you a sense of the topic, the scope, the main thesis that is presented, which is the way in which the Hudson's Bay Company mistreated the indigenous population in Canada, in the north of Canada during, roughly 200 years, more or less, or more. And the other film, too, is God Sleeps in Rwanda. And that's another film made also by Canadians, looking at the genocide in Rwanda from about roughly around the same time in the 90s. So these are films made, this particular one almost 30 years ago. The events that are depicted happened in July of 1990, July 11th to be specific. And the issue that the film Kanesatake looks at is the land rights to the indigenous population, right? As well as this golf course that is kind of right next to it. Many of you are not going to remember this because it did happen 30, almost 31 years ago. But I've included a clip, really helpful, kind of a 5-minute overview of what was called the Oka crisis. And the Oka crisis, spelled OKA, was something that riveted Canadian attention for the duration of the summer, because it lasted for a period of time, and it caught the attention of people literally around the world. So the film is done also, if you can say, kind of in real time, because when it began to happen, the filmmaker was there and thought, okay, I'm going to just sort of begin to document what's going on. Of course, not expecting this 2-month-long standoff. So it's shot in a sense in real time, which really gives it a particular edge to it, because we don't know how things are going to end up, because as it is being filmed, it is occurring. It's not a recreation. It's not a flashback. It's happening in real time. So the issue is the rights of land and this golf course that sort of came to loggerheads because the decision by the city to expand the golf course, of course, onto native land, and no one was consulted, and the indigenous population pushed back. Hence, this is what was going on. So John Chiacha is quoted as saying, "These people have seen the land disappear without having been consulted or compensated, and that, in my opinion, is unfair and unjust, especially over a golf course." And that's essentially the gist of the argument. The fact that assumptions were simply made that there would be no pushback, right? There would be no one to try to say, hey, this is our land. So when the police do show up, when there is resistance, they show up with tear gas and percussion grenades, and Marcel Lemay, a police officer, is killed. So now it gets serious. So, of course, out comes the army, the SWAT teams, and it's a standoff. And the film basically depicts this standoff as it develops in real time, which again gives it a real kind of sense of urgency. It's done really well using the editing. Those moments of quiet where we don't know what's going to happen next. So the Mohawks of Kanawake block the Mercier Bridge out of Montreal. If you don't know anything about Montreal, Montreal itself is an island, and the only way off the island, of course, is using a bridge. Mercier Bridge is not the only one. There's Jacques Cartier Bridge, which is a huge one, and a few others. So it's not like people couldn't get off the island, but people were pissed off that they had to, take the long way around to get to an area that was off the island. And the Mercier Bridge was the bridge that they would typically use. So that's, again, disruptions. These are tactics that indigenous protesters have used in the past, whether it's blocking roads, blocking a rail line. And of course, now politicians, rather than dealing with the crisis, just turn around and pass laws that say, well, it's even more illegal. So that doesn't help the case. So the Mercier Bridge is blocked by the Mohawks. The federal government steps in and says, look, we're going to pay for the land. We're going to stop the golf course. And so it's just one stalemate after another. The Mohawks refuse. They refused to back down. They refused to say, look, this is not the point, right? This is our land. It's not for sale. That's essentially what's going on. So it starts July 11th, and it wraps up kind of around the end of August, the 29th. The bridge blockade ends, and that becomes sort of, we'll say the beginning of the end, because as you can see the dates, another month, another almost 4 weeks go past until the Mohawk finally walk out unarmed. And so the result was that the population, the Mohawk population there, were able to keep the land. The golf course did not expand. And as a result of the lack of direction, the lack of leadership, the lack of direction, the lack of, how do we deal with something like this? Not the standoff, but even discussing these issues with an indigenous population. What it led to was the First Nations policing policy, which allowed a police force to actually exist on the reservation, on that land. So there would be at least a buffer between individuals who live there and the outside police force, the SQ, the Sûreté Québec, and or the army. So there would be at least an intermediary group rather than having a confrontation such as we see in the film. Now, the film itself, it's a kind of an interesting combination of expository, and what is that? That's the voice of God filmmaking, where we have a narrative that guides us through the particular narrative that's being developed. It's that, because there is a voiceover by the director, but it's also observational cinema, because it does put us in the middle of the action. We are a window on the world. Now, the filmmaker does not interact directly with the individuals that we see on the screen, so that's important. But what is happening is we're seeing these issues play out, and I keep stressing this idea of real time. It rarely happens where the documentary is filmed in that way. We don't know. The director did not know what was going to happen. And this document was going to be even more important if this thing went south. And it ended up being a bloodbath, because the film tries to present individuals as real people, the indigenous population as real people, as fathers and mothers and husbands and wives and children. Keep that in mind when we look at the way in which the army and the police are depicted, because they're depicted in very different ways. So primarily it has expository elements with the voiceover, and the voiceover is not meant to confuse or to provide a disjunction between the voice and the images. It's pretty straightforward. It clarifies and explains. And also because it's shot and then edited after the fact, the narrator often sets up something that's going to happen. But at that point, it switches back to an observational mode. So Kana Satake, it's expository. How does it accomplish this? It uses a voiceover by the director as she speaks to us and speaks to the audience to explain, clarify, set up, provide contrast or background information. So it is useful because we now understand what exactly is going on that we're seeing. So the other issue too is the fact that this is now a very new perspective on a group of people that we have known exist in Canada, but really no spotlight has ever been shone on it in the way that it is in this film. The fact that these individuals, this indigenous Mohawk population, considers the land sacred. It's not there for a golf course or to be bought and sold to someone else or high rises or whatever. It's sacred land. It's their land. So the degree to which their connection with the land, right, the spirit that they hold that is connected to that land, we haven't seen that before. Now, we've seen it since, but this is an early version of it. Remember, this is 1990. The film came out about a year or so later. So the images, the subjects, the voices are unfamiliar to us. I mentioned in another class, not this one, but in my ethics class, we were talking about the residential schools, which is an absolute black spot in Canadian history, but we cannot ignore it. We have to acknowledge that they happened. We have to acknowledge that a lot of pain was caused for the most asinine reasons. And I told my students, as I'm telling you now, I have spent my entire life in Canada, and until maybe 15, 20 years ago, I had never even heard of a residential school. That's how well the Canadian government were able to hide these kinds of, this history that they had with the Indigenous population to keep it from us. And I'm not lying. Maybe 15, 20 years ago, I heard of residential schools for the first time. So that new perspective on familiar images is absolutely correct, because we are seeing things for the first time. We're seeing sort of not a stereotypical or a caricatural view of the Indigenous population, or Indians as we used to call them, because they are First Nations people. They are Indigenous. They are the first ones here. And so what the film does is it asks us to sort of look into this world and at least to a certain degree empathize and sympathize with the situation that they're in, because we know how difficult it can be to fight either City Hall or some big developer that's, backed up with lots of money and lots of hotshot lawyers. We know we're going to lose. But this group of people said, don't care. We're going to stand up. We're going to push back. We're going to push back for as long and as hard as we have to make this stop. So the way in which the Mohawk population is characterized is they may be warrior-like, but they're not crazy. They're not savages as the way they are described in the film. They are very, very controlled. As angry as they are, they don't let it boil over. They know they're under pressure. They know they're being watched, and they know that one little slip up and it could be the end of them. So with that history behind them, it is remarkable how calm and how collected and cool they are in the face of this imminent danger. So the Mohawk are depicted in the film as basically stoic and certainly brave, absolutely brave, but they know when to move and when to fall back, right? They know that none of this can be done recklessly, because anything that is done, without thought and preparation could lead to the death of a lot of people, because you've got the army, you've got the SQ, you've got everybody watching. And guess what? They're all armed, right? This is dangerous. Now, by comparison, the government authorities are depicted somewhat robotically. All we know them as is army people, right? Lieutenants and, first class this and that. And so we only see them wearing their uniforms. So we know them only as army personnel. But the Mohawk population, we see them as brothers and sisters and fathers and mothers and, husbands and wives. So we see different facets of their life. And that's, again, a very different depiction that we have seen of an Indigenous population in Canada up until this point. Now, this film is almost 30 years old, and things have changed very dramatically in a positive way. But up until that point, this was something that people just were not seeing. So the SQ, the Sûreté Québec, it's like the Quebec Provincial Police kind of thing, because they have them there. So the SQ and the Army work together, but they are somewhat robotic, right? They only respond to commands. They're not allowed to think for themselves. They have this kind of, I'm just doing my job, right? That's what they do. And really the only kinds of emotions that we see them sort of act on is fear and anger. And yet, so is the Mohawk population. But they seem to be able to control themselves a lot better. Now, because there are camera crews from literally around the world, within, I think, about a week, this did not take long to get the world's attention. So now everyone's eyes, the world's eyes, are on this confrontation, right? These two forces ready to block heads. So the actions, by comparison, are really based on greed and deceit, because the Indigenous population have been deceived repeatedly. When you watch the first 10 minutes of The Other Side of the Ledger, that's literally what it's about. The deceit that has occurred on behalf of corporations, businesses, through government agencies. And of course, once you sign off, there's no turning back. There's no takebacks. And that's really what the last 270 years, now 290 years, 300 years of pushback from the Indigenous population, that there are takebacks, because what has happened to them has been a massive deception. So we can ask ourselves, is there a relationship between this film, which is about a particular group of people who are who have been up to this point somewhat marginalized. But is there comparison between this film and other films that, well, let's say trying to present a certain agenda, right? Because that's kind of what it's trying to do. So the director is trying to present to us, a particular point of view. So does that relate to other films that we've seen? Yes, because it is a form of propaganda, because it is trying to present a certain side in one way and another side in another way. And at the same time, though, we want to ask ourselves, is that exactly what is going on? So Obum Sawin, the director, she may call the warrior population or the Mohawk population warriors, but that's not all. They're also human beings, right? They have agency, they have intentionality, they have desires, they have got fears, but all these things really give us a much more complex view of the Mohawk population than it does the army and the police, because we see them only and exclusively in uniform. We know them only as army personnel or police personnel. So because the director is also part of the indigenous population, she has a kind of, a different viewpoint of the Mohawk population and can see them and understand them in a different way that we now get to learn about and sympathize and empathize. So we see the families together that are behind the barricades. We also get a story as to why these individuals are where they are, and why the situation has come up in this particular way. So the important thing to remember is Obum Sawin presents these individuals as farmers, fathers, husbands, brothers, and they're not just warriors. They can be if they have to, but there is a different degree of complexity to their humanity, right? They have that agency and intentionality, but we see it utilized very, very carefully. Now, the editing is really important and interesting because it does present moments of quiet and moments of laughter. And this is in the middle of a standoff. The Oka standoff was serious. And yet the director chooses periodically to kind of relieve the tension, because there is a tremendous amount of tension in this film. But she uses these moments of levity, of laughter, of just feelings of joy that because it's mixed into the overall imagery, it allows the film to relax periodically. So that is certainly important. Now, those aren't the only things that are presented in terms of contrast. There's also the burning the effigy of a Mohawk and calling them savages. Now, that's done by the local white population, because they're pissed off that their Mercier Bridge, is now out of bounds, and they've got to drive to the other side to get off the Montreal Island. So the response of the white population nearby, if anyone's a savage, it's them, because their responses are horrifying, unsympathetic, unwilling to listen, unwilling to do anything, because my God, you've disrupted my day-to-day life. How dare you? String them up, burn them alive, whatever. So burning an effigy of a Mohawk while while these people are chanting really presents a troubling image of the local white population, which really are the business interests. So that's one way in which the director can sort of intercut, the presentation of the real Mohawk versus the stereotypical view that the white population, the local population, have of them. Clearly wrong. The pacing, the editing at the end of the film too gets very frantic, because now all of a sudden the police and the army rush in. Sorry, spoiler alert, but they rush in and it gets very frantic. And there's a lot of handheld camera movement, not because it's fancy and cool, but because it was literally happening so fast that no one had time to really set things up, because it happened very quickly that these people were dragged off and the Mohawk warriors were taken away by the police. And this is happening at night, so it's disturbing and chaotic, but that's exactly what was happening. It was disturbing and chaotic. There's also this notion of action and reaction. So we see if one thing happens, then we see the other side respond to it. And then there's a reaction to that and a reaction to that, back and forth. Now, this image here that you see, of this particular Mohawk warrior and what looks like about, I think, a 19 or 20-year-old soldier. That picture was on the cover of Maclean's, and it galvanized sort of in one single image what this thing was about. And it's very powerful because, for one thing, the Mohawk warrior is leaning right into the young army gentleman, the army personnel, like leaning right in, saying, just try me. Just try me. And the tension in that image is very powerful. So what's happening here is we have a kind of chronology through the editing, kind of action and reaction, sort of movement back and forth that structures the story, structures the montage sequences. And we also have this notion that the army is made up of clearly very young men and robots, just doing my job, I'm not even thinking, just doing my job. So it does present these individuals in really striking ways. Now, because of all the things that I've talked about, the way in which the Mohawk are depicted, the way in which the army and the police are depicted, can we say this is a propaganda film? Well, it is pushing an agenda, right? It is arguing, we could argue that it is a kind of propaganda film, but when it is something that you believe in, and it's in the case of the director, this is a cause that she believed in very, very strongly, she still tried to present the other side as fair and as evenly as she could. Now, clearly, there's going to be personal interest in presenting one side as perhaps the right side, right? The right side of history, which, as it turned out, it was because of everything that led to it. But the way in which propaganda works in Triumph of the Will is there is a complete shutdown of the other side. There is literally no mention of the Jewish population that had been massacred prior to that. The night of the Long Knives, which has happened in 32, and this is a 1935. No mention of that. So propaganda in sort of propaganda light, we'll say, because it does present an agenda, it is pushing an agenda, but at least it tries to present the other side as fairly as it possibly can. But it still does present an agenda. Now, if we think of propaganda, right, it presents information to influence an audience to a particular point of view, which it does. Facts are presented. If you omit something, that's tantamount to lying. Now, here the facts are presented to the best of the director's ability, because remember, she is now behind the lines. I don't want to say enemy lines. She's behind the lines. So it's not as if she can go somewhere. I'm going to conduct some interviews with so-and-so, with, the premier of Quebec or maybe the head of the police. No, she's behind the line of Mohawk warriors inside the camp. So she can only film from that perspective. And only after the fact can she put the story together. So if there is lying by omission, for the most part, it was because the director had literally no way to get out of the camp without possibly being arrested or her camera equipment confiscated, at which point there would be no film. So there are facts that are presented, but the rest of the information, the background context, interviews after the fact, these were done. They would have to have been done after the fact for the film to really sort of flesh out and present in a fair manner both sides of the argument. Now, propaganda also likes to have a lot of loaded imagery that pushes our emotional buttons, which is what's called pathos. It's a rhetorical device. Imagery that provokes an emotional response typically does not lead to critical thought. It's not meant to do that. But here, at least, Obon Sawin, the director, does try to present both points of view. But when she does, like in The Fog of War, the director there undercuts what Robert McNamara is talking about. Here she undercuts a government message through the film footage. They're saying one thing, but doing another. And so issues like that, there is a presentation of the other side, but quite often it gets undercut by the imagery that is now in a disjunction with what's being said. So that's why at times it's observational, other times it's expository, but at other times it now tries to sort of work one against the other. The imagery complements and contrasts in a really strange ironic sort of way what is being said. So those particular things are important. There is the population, the local population in Oka, the white folks that are really mad because, damn it, you've taken my bridge, and the hell with you. So the way in which it's propagandizing, sure, it does present the Mohawk perspective primarily as the right one, and it does use footage of other people, the way they're behaving, but it wasn't staged. This is what these people were doing. This is how they were reacting. So the film, when it was finally released, it did really focus attention on the situation, focus attention on the difficulty that the Mohawk had in trying to resolve this thing without looking weak or looking, the opposite, that they were just foolish. No, they had to strike that balance. So the Globe and Mail in their review says the film transports the viewer to the barricades and camps, achieving a powerful intimacy and devastating logic, that action-reaction that I was talking about. As each piece of our story falls deftly into place, giving us the background, the history of that situation, the history of that area. We understand who was fighting and for what, and above all, how it felt to even be there. So Obumsawin avoids the pitfalls of romanticizing Mohawks and demonizing the whites, because there were some people that are willing to help. So in short, Obumsawin has documented sympathetically yet responsibly. And that's important, by presenting to the best of her abilities both sides, even though at the time she was filming, she was actually behind the Mohawk lines and couldn't get out. So from a unique perspective, what a history may judge to be the most significant event to take place on Canadian soil since the Second World War. So great response, powerful response. It was seen. The film was discussed. The film it is still considered very important because it was the first time we saw exactly what this fight has been about. We saw on a daily basis what the Mohawk were up against. Sometimes how ridiculous these claims are that, we need to make a golf course bigger. Who cares? Like, who needs more golf courses? I'm sorry. But it now is brought home in a very compelling and immediate sort of way, just what we can lose, what that population can lose if they don't stand, right? If they don't push back and they don't maintain that spirit with the land. So I'm going to come back in just a moment with another set of slides for God Sleeps in Rwanda. Back in a moment. Okay, so we're back with the second half of our video lecture. And here we're just going to talk a little bit about documentary modes and specifically God Sleeps in Rwanda. I've got a clip, roughly the first 15 minutes of the film, and it gives you kind of a sense of the scope of the film, the subject, which is of course the massacre in Rwanda in the 90s. And what I want to do is kind of go through and refresh everyone's memory about documentary modes, because those are the modes in which we understand the way in which film works, documentary film in particular, how it works in terms of its modes, the way it engages us, the way it provides information, the way that the director interacts with the subject, observational or not. So Bill Nichols, the gentleman that gives us these 6 modes of the documentary, over the last 110 years, right? So since 1910, we've had a whole range of different films. Documentary tradition essentially started with really observational. Trains entering a station, people leaving a factory, a couple kissing. We're observing. That's really what it was. But very quickly, the documentary tradition began to change and import and develop new ways of telling stories and giving us information. So Nichols argues that the documentary filmmakers aim at sort of what he calls a perfect representation of the real. I don't even know what that means. Now, I have a philosophy degree, but I also have a film degree, and I don't know what that statement means, because we can argue till the cows come home in searching for reality. What is reality? What is the real? What is truth? All those questions are important in both the documentary tradition, the tradition of philosophy. So just because Nichols says, that documentary filmmaking is the perfect representation of the real, it has its own inherent problems, as we are discovering as we go through some of these more difficult films. So the director of God Sleeps in Rwanda, Stella Bruzzi, says that, look, it's impossible to try to hold up this ideal of the perfect representation of the real. It's not possible. Even as human beings, our memory fades. We forget certain things. We sometimes fill in those gaps with things that we think might have happened. So when we are asking people about something that occurred to them, clearly they're going to focus on certain things more so than others. It's still the truth, but it could be a selective version of the truth. We don't know. But documentary, I mean, the fact that a perfect representation of the real is in quotations, because it's a quotation, keep it in a quotation. In other words, always do the old sort of 66.99 thing and go, okay, generally speaking, yes, it's a more truthful representation of the real, more truthful than fiction, but documentary films have their own inherent issues. And the issue that Stella Abruzzi has is this idea of authenticity. In this case, she talks to people that survived this massacre. And what really happens here is we get eyewitness reports. And do we have to go and verify the veracity of every single sentence, every single statement, and go, well, we need corroborating proof? Well, when you have enough people telling you what's going on, let's say you have 1,000 individuals that were lucky enough to survive a massacre, and the tens of thousands of people were killed, were shot, were macheted, were beheaded. It was horrible, but these people managed to survive. So do we sit there and question their reality, question their truth? So if a documentary is going to be made about something, at one point the director has to simply trust the eyewitnesses, trust the people that are saying these particular things. Now, I can hear in the back of your mind going, well, hold on, sir. Like, what about, Errol Morris and The Fog of War? Well, here it's pretty clear that Robert McNamara is reinventing and revising history to make him look better, right? So it's more favorable to him. I had second thoughts about the Second World War and Vietnam. Well, you didn't at the time, right? And that's what Errol Morris does. He undercuts what McNamara is telling as the truth. Here, there is footage, and it is gruesome. I just want to warn you, but it's luckily done from a considerable distance, but it's still awful to view because it actually happened. So the degree to which the voices are speaking of an authentic experience, Stella Abruzzi goes out of her way to underpin what they're saying with imagery that doesn't contrast or disjoin what they're saying. Here is evidence. This is what they saw. This is what they eyewitnessed. We have footage. There are people who were there who saw it. Now, if you're interested, by all means, do watch the rest of the film. It's broken up in sections on YouTube, but just the first 10, 15 minutes will give you a sense of what the film is about. So what the documentary tradition is doing ultimately is providing documents of world events. And these documents are important, but we need to know the mode in which they are presented. And so we're just going to take a quick look at the modes that we've looked at so far. The first one, the expository mode, the voice of God. There is verbal commentary. That commentary is logical and reasonable. It presents information, and what is being said is now underpinned with the images. The images serve the voice in the expository mode. And it often uses a narrator. It used to have, a male voice. That's why it's called the voice of God. But eventually women were allowed to voice films. And for example, the Kanesatake film is a perfectly good example. It's the director herself who is doing the voiceover, which really makes it work. It really sort of ties it all together. Nature documentaries where you're just watching, wildlife and insects and whatever. It's expository. It could be observational too. Now, when we think of films that conform to that particular mode, any of the films that we watched from the Second World War, the Why We Fight series, there was a whole range of those. Those are basically expository. Nanook of the North was expository, even though it didn't have a voice of God. It did have at least the intertitles that gave us very specific information about what was either coming up or what had just occurred. So there's no confusion. That voice, whether it's an intertitle or it's an actual voice that we hear, provides kind of narrative closure. Here's what we have seen. Here's what we're about to see. So there's no confusion. So many of the films that we have seen are primarily expository. Another mode that we looked at, Baraka, is a really good example of the poetic mode. It kind of moves away from what we'll call objective reality, and instead it seeks to edit sequences along a kind of, well, inner truth. What does that mean? It is viewing something on a higher level, right? It's looking at something as representing something else. It's poetic in the sense that a lot of poetry, for example, the French symbolists of the 1870s would look at something. They would have a very deep personal connection to something they were looking at, and that thing represented something else. You could look at a ship sailing off, and you think, I'm thinking of history. It's moving away. It's drifting away. It's fading off into the horizon, or a lost love. Any of these kinds of things. It doesn't matter what that image is, that object or even person, but the poet, or in this case the filmmaker, imbues it with some kind of inner truth. We have to watch the film or read the poem to understand why that image is important. So, poetic mode, that inner truth, the reason why something captures the attention of the filmmaker or the poet. It can be done through visual associations or rhythmic associations. There could be a movement on the screen of one object and it segues into something else. Something that's not very kind. It's a Fritz Lang film. I think the movie M. It's a shot of women that are kind of in this little circle, and they're just talking to each other and they're chirping away. And he cuts to chickens squawking back and forth. It's not very nice, but we get the idea, right? The inner truth that's being presented. Now, M is not a nonfiction; it's a fiction film. But sometimes the poetic mode can be very simple like that. Even The Fog of War, when McNamara is, saying, well, if Vietnam, if we let it go, then the rest of it's just going to fall. And literally we see dominoes falling onto a map. So that's that sort of momentary poetic mode. Now, an entire film can be poetic or just certain moments. So which films conform to this mode? We've seen Baraka. We've seen parts of The Fog of War that work in much the same way. Now, one that you watched last week, Warrendale, is part of the observational mode. It's a window into a particular world. The film we're going to watch next week, Titicut Follies, is also part of the observational mode. Frederick Wiseman is a well-known documentary maker that was really interested in institutions, whether it's a mental institution or a prison or a high school. And that was the view that we had into that world. So what the filmmaker is trying to do is to capture, again, this objective reality, quote unquote. The filmmaker is just going to stand by in the corner and just watch, just like a closed circuit camera. Just watch the events that are occurring. Now, the director can do that. But remember, the director also has final say in the way the film is shaped. The editing sequences, the montage sequence, all those things are decisions made by the filmmaker after the fact. And we know that Warrendale, for example, there was 40 hours of footage cut down to an hour and a half. So that's pretty remarkable. Imagine all the things that happened to you in one day. And if you were to say, well, I only have a minute and a half to show somebody my entire day. Well, of course you're going to pick all the things that are, that make you look good. But what about, somebody says, well, I filmed you for the entire 8 hours and I'm going to just film every time you pick your nose, right? It's going to make you look like a pig. Well, that's what I mean. So observational mode, it may be in the filming section, but not always in the editing section because decisions are made. Now, not to confuse everyone, the filmmaker remains hidden behind the camera, doesn't influence events, so that's observational. Warrendale is a really good example, probably the first one that we watched that is exclusively observational. The Story of a Facelift, forgot her name, but Story of a Facelift. That's, again, partly participatory and partly observational. Daisy, the Story of a Facelift. It just came to me. Sorry about that. that film is a combination of participatory and observational. So there are many different films that we have and will continue to look at that fit into that mode. Now, the participatory mode, like we just talked about, Daisy, the Story of a Facelift, this one, the director engages, with the subjects that we see on the screen. They engage with the subject matter. We see the director go to the New York Public Library to look up information on our fascination with beauty and our fascination with faces. The impact of the filmmaker is often what is really sort of interesting about the film. And Michael Moore's films, Roger and Me, is a really good example of the participatory mode. So we're going to see one of the best examples in quite a few years. Whatever your thoughts are on Michael Moore, because he certainly has popularized the documentary tradition, but even he has his problems. But the impact that the filmmaker has on the film, its structure, its story, the unfolding of events, is directly the result of the filmmaker engaging with the subject. Another film that we saw quite early in this course, Man with a Movie Camera, still fascinating to watch, still love that movie. Came out in the late 1920s in Russia. And the reflexive mode is that self-reflection upon the filmmaking process, the awareness of what filmmaking is, the way in which film can manipulate space and time, speed things up, slow things down, double them up, make them color black and white. The whole nature of filmmaking is there to be studied and deconstructed and taken apart and looked at and, of course, then put back together again. Here at this point, there is a conscious awareness that the film does in some way alter the truth. So here, as much as expository thinks it's presenting the truth, reflexive mode is really concerned with presenting a truth, a version of the truth. Reflexive mode, certainly The Fog of War is one, but say Man with a Movie Camera is another really good one. The artifice, right? The way in which film is a discourse and a discourse constructed, it shows that. It literally shows that. Remember the scene in Man with a Movie Camera? We see an editor. We see an editor editing the film that we are watching. Cannot be much more self-reflexive than that. Then the last one, performative. The filmmaker here again is, so participatory and performative are very similar. The difference is the director often has a vested interest in the subject matter. In this case, you can see the image. He or she could have been a survivor of a concentration camp, an eyewitness to an event. In the case of Michael Moore, he lost his job at working the GM plant in Flint, Michigan. So he had a vested interest in the subject matter. So as much as we have participatory, let's say Michael Rubo and his relationship with Daisy, Michael Rubo did not have a facelift, nor does he wish to have a facelift. He just happens to know Daisy that wants to go for one. That's different than performative, where Michael Moore was directly affected by the subject matter, which is the closing of the GM plant in Flint and him deciding to find out why this was so. So performative has more to do with the individual that has a very clear link to the subject matter and to often the people that are there that we see depicted in the film. Now, the last thing I want to look at is the idea of pathos. It's Greek for suffering. We use it as a rhetorical device, like I said, to amplify and underline and connect with an audience's emotions. So if you are using it as a rhetorical device, advertisers use it quite often because it does push buttons. So what's happening with pathos is you are presenting something to an individual and you put a cute baby in there, or you put something that is going to allow someone to respond emotionally. Many of the memes you probably have seen on Facebook over the last 6 or 8 months leading up to the American election, and we have them too in Canada coming up to our own elections, a lot of political commentary that is not wise, it's not critical, it's emotional. And when you respond emotionally to something, you're not usually thinking critically. And that's precisely the point. People want to push your buttons and want to get you pissed off about something. So here, when we use pathos, it's not necessarily to irritate and to anger people, but sometimes to allow them to feel sorry for you, to sympathize and empathize with you. Because if you are looking at a film like God Sleeps in Rwanda, you feel their suffering. You feel the absolute abject fear that these people must have experienced, wondering if they're going to be next, if they're going to end up just a statistic, just gone. So when we are using pathos, an emotional response, when that really works is when the writer asks you to respond emotionally to something that the writer or filmmaker is discussing, is trying to get you to see, and that meaning you understand because the material is presented, but it's also presented in a compelling emotional way. It kind of gets under your skin. It becomes more impactful because you've responded to it both on intellectual level, because the material is presented, whether it's eyewitness evidence, filmed evidence, or experts, but we also have the eyewitness and the awful things that those people experienced. So we feel for them, right? We have the intellect on the one hand, then we have the emotional aspect on the other. And so an emotional appeal in a documentary film can be used in a number of different ways. It can be used, simply as a hook. This person saw the following. This was awful. And he or she, survived this. This is their story. Okay, so you start to listen. And so you want to make sure that the way it is delivered, it's not, crying all the way through. There has to be some reasonable logic to it, some background information, some kind of credible evidence to say that what this person went through is and was as bad as they say it was. So when we have footage, as we see in God Sleeps in Rwanda, that eyewitness footage, not eyewitness evidence, we have the footage, the film footage of it, it really brings it home. And we realize, my God, these people, just literally survived their lives. So it works providing you're on the same side, because the pathos of a speech or writing is only determined ultimately by the hearer. If I don't care, if I thought that what happened in Rwanda was a fantastic thing, or, the downing of the World Trade Center, or whatever, it doesn't matter. If I think it was a great idea, that pathos isn't going to work on me, because I've already made up my mind. I've already considered the facts, and I've come out, luckily, on the wrong side of history. But pathos only works if you leave yourself open to it. If you are going to tune out anything that is emotional and just go for the facts, it's not going to work. So you have to allow yourself to become empathetic, or become empathetic as well, to understand really what is happening, because otherwise the story just simply isn't going to work on that level. So is pathos important in political documentaries? Because more or less, this is what we're watching. Both of these films are political documentaries. It's good for social purpose. It makes us understand the degree to which these people experience pain, suffering. They escape with their lives. It can also incite action, because we may feel sorry, but we could also get pissed off and say, yeah, let's do something about this. Let's make sure this never happens again. And you're responding this way because you have now, you've cued into the emotional responses built into the document. So you are meant to feel, but you're also meant to think. Here is the evidence. Here's information. Here's the background that you need. But look at what happened. So you feel as much as you think and say, yeah, will it incite action? Absolutely. Now, is it an effective technique? It is, if it's something that you're not sure about, you've only heard a little bit about. It's an effective technique providing you have not made up your mind about a particular situation. If you have, then it's not going to be very effective. So when filmmakers do this, they need to be very careful that they present it in such a way that there is at least the possibility of the viewer, sort of taking down that armor and going, okay, I'll listen. What have you got? And so it will work in that sense. But if you've made up your mind and you don't care what people say, pathos is not going to work. So it will present information to people that may know just a little bit about a particular world event. So the massacre in Rwanda, we saw it from the other side of the world, and it seemed to be, and it lasted a period of time. We knew it was happening, but we really didn't get the details. Now, here's a film that literally parachutes right in the middle of it, said now it's over, but talk to people who survived. So it is meant for an audience that knows little or nothing about a particular topic, has an interest in it for sure, because otherwise you wouldn't be watching the documentary. But it is a strategy that if we know just enough that, hey, this was a bad thing, this is the film about it, I'm going to watch it. Or the case of Michael Moore, right? As much as he acts like a clumsy person, he's not. He's very shrewd, and he's deliberate in the way he presents himself as kind of this, Fred Flintstone type of character. Probably have no idea who this guy is, but, he presents himself as somebody that seems to not know what's going on when in fact he clearly does know. That's a presentation. So there is a kind of pathos there where he shows the enemy, the bad guy, as a fool. And we laugh and we respond emotionally. But his films also have background information. So the films we see today, or for this week, it's the same thing. There is a sense of pathos. There is an emotional response that is there, and it's there for us to tune into. But there is still a lot of information that is presented to us, because these are why we call them marginalized voices. We haven't heard from them yet. So that strategy will work, providing the audience is ready to invest their time into watching it. Okay, so those are our slides for this week. Kana Satake, I'm going to have the quiz open for Monday. It's going to go for the full week till the next Wednesday, I believe. Wrote it down, from the 8th until the 16th. So got a couple days to watch the film. I checked all the links. Everything is working. But what I would recommend doing is maybe watching the second one, the little 5-minute Oka Crisis, or the Oka Crisis in 5 minutes, I think is what it's called. Watch that so you get a clear sense of what the story was about. Then watch the film, because then you get that everyday sort of, sometimes it gets boring. Sometimes it's very frightening. Other times it's just kind of like action reaction. People just don't know what to do next. So very, very well put together, very compelling film. But watch the 5-minute Oka Crisis in summary, so you at least know what's going on. Because for most of you, you weren't even born yet, and it was over 30 years ago. But it was very important, trust me. Okay, so that's enough of that, and I will see you again on Wednesday, hopefully. And at that point, I'll give you a little bit more insight into both the films. So take care and see you then.